So, in order to think a bit further about this idea of social change and how we might want to think about it as present in Great Expectations, I want to turn to the text I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, which was published in 1848. And I want to connect up that text with Great Expectations. I'm going to do that to help us think about this question of how a novelist in the 19th century thinks about what is happening to English society, the dramatic, extraordinary, terrifyingly fast process of social change that Britain underwent in this period. I really think that Marx and Engels can help us think about that process. Okay, so I'll begin by reading two passages from the Communist Manifesto. As I say, this is a text that was written and published in 1848, so that's about 20 years before Great Expectations was first serialized. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses this distinctive feature. It has simplified the class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat. All fixed, fast frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relationship with his kind. So let's just begin by reading the words on the page here. What are Marx and Engels arguing about society at this time? They describe a world which is changing rapidly, which is moving at high speed, but in which everything is simplifying. Society is becoming more simple, less complex. Essentially, society is becoming divided into two great hostile camps that they call the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. That is, the workers, the people who work in factories, and the factory owners. By the way, I think these ideas are as relevant now as they were in the 19th century. We may think of ourselves as living in a much more complicated society than the Victorians did. But if you think about all of the labour which is outsourced to places like China and India, where all of the high-tech gadgets that we own and enjoy and the cheap clothes that we buy from Primark are produced, then I think on a global level, this division of the world into two great camps is absolutely true. And I think that's why texts like the Communist Manifesto and also Great Expectations are still really important to us today. So, I think literature is about all of these things. It's about all of these social realities. It's about class, it's about money, it's about the desires and fantasies that inequalities in society produce. But it looks at those things in a distinctly literary way. To refer back to the language of my previous podcast, it's not as if all these things are inside the box and we can just take them out. These issues are woven into and melded with the telling of stories, the production of writing. And if you look at Marx and Engels, in a sense, the passage that I've read out to you is already a very literary passage. There's a really powerful figurative mode of description which is going on in this text. I'm not sure that there's a big distinction between Dickens on the one hand and Marx and Engels in terms of the way that they're writing. So let's reread the second part of this passage that I've looked at with you and think about it in connection with Great Expectations. All fixed, fast frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relationship with his kind. I do think this is extraordinary writing, every bit as powerful in its way as the writing of the great novelists of the 19th century. What is being described here is a great loosening of the hold that tradition once had over society. Once upon a time, this passage seems to say, men's and women's social relations were fixed and stable. They were ordered by the church, for example, and by the hierarchies that the workplace produced. Now all of that has been dissolved. All that was once holy has been profaned, as money is revealed as the real motor, the real engine for social relations. What kind of a process of social change is going on here? We might want to reframe that question. Is there really a process of social change going on? Or is it the case, as Marx and Engels seem to imply, that what's happening in society in the 19th century is that veils of illusion are being stripped away, that something which has always been true, the fact that men and women are organised by money, by an economy, by work and by labour, are being laid bare? Is some truth being revealed in the process of the 19th century? Or is something new, a new society being created? I think that's a really interesting question to puzzle out with this text, although I'm not sure it comes to a conclusive answer. But when Marx and Engels say, man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relationship with his kind, they seem to be suggesting in some way that some sort of truth, some kind of human truth, is being revealed in this process of social change. So maybe we're wrong to think always about the 19th century as a period of great social change, as I suggested it was at the beginning of this podcast. Maybe we should think of it rather as a period in which things as they are were unveiled, uncovered. Okay, so for the last few minutes of the podcast, let's return to Great Expectations, having looked at a little bit of Marx and Engels, and think about how Dickens, in his novel, manifests this same process of social change and transformation. Let's look at another part of the opening scene of the novel. So you'll remember that there's Pip out in the graveyard on Christmas Eve. As in my previous podcast, this is a scene which takes place on Christmas Eve. A typical kind of Gothic situation, a churchyard, the wind blowing on Christmas Eve, and then he encounters this spectral, terrifying, disturbing figure of a convict who looks like he's stepped right out of a kind of fairy story. He's some kind of ogre. And this convict picks Pip up, turns him upside down and shakes him to see if he has any food in his pockets. The man, after looking at me for a moment, turned me upside down and emptied my pockets. There was nothing in them but a piece of bread. When the church came to itself, for he was so sudden and strong that he made it go head over heels before me, and I saw the steeple under my feet. When the church came to itself, I say, I was seated on a high tombstone, trembling, while he ate the bread ravenously. I think it's really interesting that Dickens, or Pip the narrator, repeats this phrase, when the church came to itself. He's underlining that phrase for us. He's making us think about it. So I'd want you to think about what's happening sort of visually in this scene. The church spire is being turned upside down. Pip sees his feet because he's looking upside down as the convict dangles him by his legs. Pip sees his feet above the church spire. Is Dickens perhaps giving us, in this very early stage of the novel, a vision of the world turned upside down. All that is solid melts into air, say Marx and Engels. All that is holy is profaned. Is Dickens, in a similar way, indicating to us that the world of this novel will be a world in which the whole social hierarchy has been inverted? Thank you very much.